Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sit sapientiae.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Salve, boys.
Somehow I'm a couple of copies short. Let's see. Check what's actually the case. Okay, so about page 95. Right, so they talking about the precise bearing of the Pope's argument that the civil and ecclesiastical powers are truly distinct. They have to be united, one in many senses, but they are still truly two things that are truly distinct. So it has been attempted to stretch the application of these words, and modern innovators claim to prove them an indirect condemnation of the temporal sovereignty now vested in the Holy See, as the times and wants of society have consecrated it in our midst. So Darius was writing at the time, to believe this work was published before the seizure of the Papal States, of which, of course, the Pope was the civil ruler. And the ideas of the revolutionaries, Freemasons, all kinds of horrible leftist people at the time were floating all these ideas. Ultimately, the church shouldn't have to deal with temporal things or material wealth or territorial possessions. The church should just focus on spiritual things. So essentially saying, well, we can just go and steal whatever we want because we don't think the church should have it. First of all, it's false, just outright false, to say that the church should not have any of those things. The church needs resources. There is most definitely a human side to the church, and just like anything, it requires resources to run an organization consisting of huge numbers of people. Just the royal courts of the past were famous for their extravagance. And the Holy See, for example, every diocese needs resources, but it's not unfitting that the Holy See be adorned with magnificent churches, being the see of St. Peter himself. So just one little example of just one little proof of the fact that it makes absolutely no sense to say the church should have no temporal possessions, no material wealth. I mean, even if assuming that were somehow true. Certainly it's not true in itself, but even assuming, which was not the case, that those people had been right under the particular circumstances under which they were speaking, just because you think somebody shouldn't have any wealth does not just entitle you to go and take it. Right? Nobody would agree on that principle concerning his own possessions, certainly. It makes absolutely no sense that should be true concerning the possessions of any group or organization, most of all the church. So all of that was just nonsensical. Anyway, and it was all for the purpose of forging these monolithic nation states and to have those nation states founded on the principles of the Enlightenment. And obviously that was not going to work in the Papal States. There was one version of things in which the Pope would be a kind of president sitting over the whole of Italy. More of a soft seizure of the Papal States. That was one version of things, or one idea. That was Gilberti's idea. that really we should forge an Italian nation state, and the papal states ought to be a part of that, obviously. So they thought, and the Pope can sit on, don't take them from him technically, just make him in temporal terms into just something of a figurehead, something like the British monarch over all of Italy, something analogous to that at least. There was another version that was the hardline version, so to speak, which was just seize everything, which is what ended up happening. They were just stolen outright. Just conquering forces came in and took over. So, in other words, what we're saying here is that the two powers are truly distinct, and that the church is not primarily, let's say, members of the church may be infested with its power in the civil order, in the temporal order, but that's not the main focus of the church's efforts. The main focus of the church's efforts is in the spiritual domain, and the church's authority is spiritual, as the Pope has, of course, the plenitude of jurisdiction in all things, matters of faith and morals, ecclesiastical discipline, and all things spiritual everywhere in the church. And that is what the jurisdiction, ecclesiastical jurisdiction, that the church is focused on and exercising. That is the first object of attention. So St. Gelasius refers only to the special attributes of each individual power, neither of which may encroach upon the other's domain. So that means domain. That's related to the word domain. The other is sphere of influence, and the church has, in fact, never actually encroached upon the civil power. If there are any instances of that, there are very few and far between, and not even the enemies of the church ever seem to bring them up ever. And rest assured, they would if there were any such cases. But there are plenty of examples of the civil power encroaching upon the rights of the church. Many examples. So even the section of history that we're looking at now, even this early on in the history of the church, we're not even at the year 500 yet, and already you can see that the civil power is giving the church all kinds of trouble. So St. Gelasius by no means intended to convey that the Pope, as spiritual sovereign, was by that very title incapable of holding as a temporal king a territory which should secure his personal independence insofar as it tends to promote peace and quiet among all nations. So it can happen that in any given situation that the church and state must be united, but it can happen that this church in some ways might become too reliant on the state. In fact, that could happen. In other words, it could be that the state pay the salaries of the clergy, which we say too much. That's not a bad thing in itself, but per accidens it is, because it has as an accidental effect the fact that the civil power can, when it chooses to, essentially hold the clergy to ransom. So we won't pay you unless you do what we want. So that's not an evil thing in itself, but that's not a great arrangement either. We wouldn't characterize that as ideal. Ideally, the church has her own resources and operates on those and cannot be held to ransom by the civil power. Now, civil power could use force, obviously, to steal church property and so on, but there's only so much that can be done to prevent that. In many cases, nothing at all. But at least it's better that the church have her own resources to rely on. So the life of this holy pope was as worthy of admiration as his erudition. Notice at this point, most popes, if not all, are still saints. The lofty dignity with which he had been invested was, in his eyes, a servitude rather than a claim to power. His time was given to prayer and meditation on sacred scripture. His mind, so rich in ecclesiastical learning, displays itself in his immense correspondence and the works we have quoted. So he died on November 21st of 496, having ruled the Church of God for 4 years. So clearly it was a busy 4 years. He had established as an obligatory custom that all the faithful should receive the Holy Eucharist under both forms. So notice that, he says, an obligatory custom may or may not have actually been a law, strictly speaking, of the church at this point. So A law essentially has to be promulgated. A law is an ordinance promulgated by the competent authority to provide for the common good. That is the definition of a law. And part of the definition is that it must be promulgated. But there are customs that can obtain, this is recognized in canon law, there are customs that can obtain the force of law. In other words, they are certain things are done and you have to do them, even if there's no law that has been promulgated requiring you to do it. You are bound to that as just as much as though there were a law requiring it, an officially promulgated law requiring it. So, obligatory custom, probably our author here would use the term law if he had established this as a law, as a lex, rather than as an obligatory custom. So the Pope can require things of the faithful as he wishes. Yes, most definitely the promulgation of a law is done according to certain procedures, so it's clear to everybody that it has been promulgated. The current method, let's say current according to the current discipline in the church, that the Holy See has chosen to employ, and that means up into and including Pius X, was a publication of a document in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, which we have copies of that in the library here. But whether something appears in there, it has been promulgated to the entire church, or at least to, right? And it's not selective. I suppose the Pope could choose to publish something in there that's promulgated only to a certain number of people, but definitely once it's in there, it has been promulgated. And if you see it published in the Acta, it has been promulgated. If it does not appear there, it has not been promulgated, well, at least not to the entire church. The Pope can promulgate things as he wishes. But also keep in mind that here that's just one way of expressing the will of the Pope in enacting various decrees, whether that be doctrinal, disciplinary, etc., whatever the case might be. That is just the chosen format. And the point is, the bottom line is that the will of the Sovereign Pontiff has been made clear. And that need not take any particular form. So some people like to point, for example, to try to make some case that the Novus Ordo Missae wasn't validly promulgated. There's an attempt to explain why they can reject the new Mass but still recognize Paul VI, who promulgated it, as a true Pope, and his successors. They say, well, it wasn't validly promulgated. Some T wasn't crossed, or an I wasn't dotted, or the secretary put the wrong date on the paper or something. But when you actually look at it closely, there is no such problem. All the usual protocols were followed perfectly. People like to try to make some case that it wasn't really done, which is speculate as to how that came about, but if that may well have something to do with, at least among certain groups of people, that idea may easily gain traction because of the separation of powers in so many countries. Whereas, the president has to be held to the laws just as much as anybody else does, and he can't change the laws or anything like that, and he has to. So the interpretation of the law is just left up to, effectively to whatever judge oversees a trial, and things like that. And all of that is, it's really the effect, this idea that you can tell the Pope what he has actually promulgated and what he has not actually promulgated is an absurdity. Because the church never was any such separation of powers. I mean, objectively, it's all the same thing anyway. Whoever has jurisdiction has all the powers of a judge, of an executor, and legislator. So objectively, it's all jurisdiction. Those are just different aspects of jurisdiction. But certainly in the case of the Sovereign Pontiff, if he makes his will known, any real Pope makes his will known, that's it. The principle is that the church cannot lead souls to hell. So maybe, even if you could prove that a T wasn't crossed or an I wasn't dotted, if you some technicality, you could say that the usual protocol for promulgation of liturgical laws somehow were not followed. Those protocols are somehow not followed it is, in fact, supposed promulgation, but in the minds of those who say Paul VI is the true Pope, they even have to say the promulgation of the new Mass. Even if that were true, that doesn't matter. It has been, in fact, imposed everywhere. The question is, has it been imposed? Obviously, it's been imposed. everywhere. Paul VI made that abundantly clear. The Vatican II was binding, made that absolutely clear. He seemed to change his tune as to whether it contained extraordinary magisterium or not. Once he said that, many heads of extraordinary magisterium. What he meant by that, some might debate. But objectively, extraordinary magisterium means definitions. Yeah, it's cathedra or a council. That's what extraordinary magisterium means. And then he said later on, it's supreme ordinary jurisdiction, which is not a term you find in any book. But in any case, even if so, whatever the case with regard to that, whatever the case with regard to anybody's opinions on the technicalities of how the new mass was promulgated, clearly it was imposed everywhere. But that's just made clear by the fact that in the 1980s, JP2 gave an indult, famously, for some people to use the John the 23rd Mass. And the very fact that was called an indult means that special permission was in fact needed. That is an indult, it's a special permission. Something you usually, ordinarily can't do, but with this indult, you have special permission to do it. So clearly, in the mind of JP2, if you say he's the Pope, then he, in his mind, clearly, the traditional Mass was not something permitted to be used under ordinary circumstances. You need a special indult. So, that the point being that the Pope can make his will known in any number of ways. And that once it has been made manifest, officially manifest, this is what you have to do, that is promulgated. Whether it's promulgated in the form of a law specifically, or just the will of the Pope makes itself known in some other way, whatever the case, once it has been established, it binds everybody. So he establishes that as an obligatory custom, that faithful should receive the Holy Eucharist under both forms. So notice what we have here. This ordinance was chiefly intended to combat the doctrine of the Manichaeans of the day, who held wine in abhorrence, asserting that it was the gall of the prince of darkness and a creature of the devil. Such were their own words. So they might get along with today's Protestants, who seem to have a notion that wine is intrinsically evil. Protestants have really no notion of anything being intrinsically evil. They're not very good at making distinctions. So they just see that alcohol causes evil, therefore it must be evil. That's about as far as they think. So that's why you have that gave rise to prohibition for one thing in the early 20th century, which was an absurdity, and that also is why you have a minimum legal drinking age in this country, which is also gives rise to absurdity, at least in as much, whatever you might think about that, then at least it gives rise to absurdity in the sense that there are some counties in this country where somebody could get an abortion but not have a glass of wine on a particular day. So some young woman who wants an abortion could get one, but is below the minimum drinking age. I mean, it gives rise to absurdities like that. I mean, the real travesty there, obviously, is the fact that abortion is legally permitted anywhere. A grave sin against the Fifth Commandment. But it is just considering just on the lowest possible level, it's immediately absurd. So, such were their own words, such were the words of the Manichaeans. The custom of receiving under both kinds was observed until the 12th century, when it began to fall into disuse and was finally abolished by the Council of Constance in 1416. So the Council of Constance is famous for other reasons. We'll get to that down the line, 1,000 years in our timeline down the line. But notice that the Manichaeans, clearly, they had a sense that transubstantiation could not possibly take place under the appearances of under the species of wine if they think it's how they put a gall of the prince of darkness and a creature of the devil. So someone refusing to receive Holy Communion under both kinds, well, he might be refusing that because he's a Manichaean. All right, objectively, it is enough for receiving Holy Communion to receive both the body and blood of Christ, to receive under the appearances, under the species of bread alone. The dogmatic theologians are very clear on that. It's through concomitance, as it's called, that when the celebrant of the Mass says the words of consecration over the host, that by those words, yes, the substance of the body of Christ becomes present, and also the substance of his blood, because those go together. They are no longer separable. Christ no longer sheds his blood. So where his body is, there also is his blood. And the same thing, where his blood is, there also is his body. So it is, in fact, sufficient to receive Holy Communion under only one species. And that's contrary to what Martin Luther said later on. Other heretics down the line said you have to receive under both kinds to receive validly, to actually receive Holy Communion. And that's also false. So for obviously 1416, that's before Martin Luther came along. The custom was done away with. There are other reasons for doing away with the custom of receiving under the species of wine, because one thing that can spill fairly easily, and there's risk of desecration. There are. It probably was not well known at the time. It's a relatively recent understanding how diseases are spread. That is understood better now than probably any time in the history of the world. But there are, in fact, also hygienic concerns. Obviously, many people sipping or drinking the accidents of wine from the same chalice, that could be an easy way to spread diseases. So there are a number of reasons why you might do away with that. But this is an example of a disciplinary law that the church can change, and in fact has changed over time. Popes can do this. So it's interesting to note that it was this custom was established as a way of combating heresy, as a profession of faith. So somebody at the time who would fail to receive under the species of wine would certainly be violating the clearly established custom, the obligatory custom. But he would also potentially be running the risk of violating the obligation to profess the faith. Because there is also an obligation to profess the faith. Not only to hold, but also profess it. And it's not to say that let's go around constantly proclaiming truths of the faith to anybody who is within earshot. That's not what that means. What it means is whenever there is an obligation to profess it, that we actually do profess it. There are ways to tell when there is an obligation to do so. But it must, in fact, be openly professed. And there are various different ways of failing in that obligation. For example, one of them is to say on a form, sometimes you have to fill out various paperwork, items of paperwork, and sometimes they'll ask you a religion on it for whatever reason. Somebody wants to know that for some reason. It's legitimate. I mean, it's something that it's not sinful to answer that question. If you answer correctly, say Roman Catholic, obviously. But it would actually be sinful to write or to check off Christian instead. But objectively, yes, Roman Catholic and Christian are synonymous terms. Cannot be one without being the other, whatever heretics might pretend is the case. But the way that the term Christian is commonly used, the way it's perceived, refers to various heretical sects. So if someone says, I'm a Christian, you automatically think, oh, he must be a heretic. Because there is, in fact, an obligation under the title of professing, we are required under the title of the obligation to profess the faith to call ourselves Catholics. Certainly to anybody who would make a mistake otherwise. I mean, to deny that you are, whenever someone asks, are you a Christian? You say, well, yes, I'm a Roman Catholic. Because those are synonymous terms. We cannot deny being a Christian. You just have to, because that would also be, in fact, an offense against the obligation to profess the faith. But you have to be crystal clear about what we mean by that. Make it clear, yes, I am, and I understand that to be a synonymous term with Roman Catholic. So this is definitely, this requirement laid down by Pope St. Gelasius was engineered to see to it that, well, to root out heretics for one thing, anybody who might suddenly stop receiving Holy Communion altogether, or not receive, or refuse to receive under the species of wine, may well be a Manichae. It would fall under high suspicion of that, certainly. And automatically, there's no other reason to refuse. Why else would there be? Unless someone had some special dispensation from that, that's another thing. But ordinarily, if someone were to refuse that, then you would think, okay, there are good grounds for doubt here, at any rate. So the Council of Trent granted the privilege of receiving under both species to the kings of France on the day of their coronation, and to deacons and subdeacons of certain churches on Sundays and high festivals. So that has also changed. That is no longer the case. There are no more kings of France, for one thing, and also the deacons and subdeacons, when they simply receive under the species of bread. And in fact, any priest who receives Holy Communion, not in the actual act of celebrating Mass, because the celebrating of Mass has to receive Holy Communion, and he has to receive it under both species, even to this day, obviously. But any priest who receives Holy Communion either outside of Mass or at a Mass of which he is not the celebrant, Sometimes happens. Sometimes you have no, as a priest, you have no choice but to do that. Say during Holy Week, Holy Thursday, or Holy Saturday, if you're not the celebrant of the ceremony, then there's only one mass permitted in a church on that day. Ordinarily, under ordinary circumstances, there's only one mass permitted in a church on those days. Then your only chance to receive Holy Communion is from another priest. So receive another species of bread only. All right. Pontificate now of St. Anastasius II. After an interregnum of 7 days, Anastasius, a native of Rome, was raised to the chair of St. Peter on November 28th of 496. So notice we have quick turnarounds here. Interregnums don't last very long at this period, which is a good thing. It's a good thing. Prolonged interregnums give rise to all kinds of problems. The Church of God, long wrung with grief in the east by the Greek schism, in Africa, Italy, Spain, and Gaul by the inroads of barbarians, carrying along with them Arianism or idolatry, was now raised up by two subjects of great consolation. One was the heroic perseverance of the Christian nation of the East, the Armenians, who are now largely, if not mostly, in schism, but at the time they were Catholics. The other, the conversion of the first Christian nation of the West, improperly so-called, Catholic nation, as we've just been saying, of the West, the Franks. So we saw, in other words, this time, during this reign, the nation of France is founded. We'll see that the baptism of Clovis, very famously, is considered as king of the Franks, who had effectively conquered the former Roman province of Gaul and the tribes that lived there. The baptism of Clovis is considered to be the founding moment of the nation of France. That was a long time in coming, obviously. Clovis did not conquer all of Gaul the day that, or whatever his kingdom was. He did not conquer it all the very day he was baptized. So it was a long time in being forged. But it's interesting, the Franks were in fact a Germanic tribe. It's not Germanic, it's not the same thing as the Germans of today. That the nation of Germany had also not yet been forged. In fact, would not really be forged until the 19th century. Germany as the German Empire, the Second Reich, as it was called. The first, well, they had the Austrian Empire, but a unified, centralized Germany did not come into existence until the 19th century. But there were many small German states that were technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire didn't. That the emperor had little power in practice, and whoever it was usually the king of some other country. For example, Emperor Charles V was mainly king of Spain. He spent all his power was in Spain as king of Spain over the Habsburg Empire that Spain was at the time, and he spent most of his time being king of Spain. So he couldn't control much about what went on in Germany. If he had been, things would have been better for the church at the time, but in fact, he wasn't. So, unified, centralized Germany is a product of the 19th century, a part of the same movement that produced the general continental movement that produced a unified Italy, that saw also at the same time, not only continental but worldwide, that saw actually the holding together of the United States as one, or holding it together and according to one aspect, and forging it in another aspect into, in fact, a monolithic nation. That from which effectively there's no question whether anybody could secede from it or not. That was in the 1860s. So it was all happening around the same time. All this forging of either officially producing nation states or solidifying ones that already existed. Holding together and solidifying ones that already existed. So you have that in Germany, you have that in Italy, you have that in North America, in the United States. So that was the general movement of the time. So, but that all started, we'll get to this in a second. Whilst Armenia was gloriously, so Darius goes into this whole long thing about what the Armenians were doing. We're not going to look at the particulars of it, but while Armenia was gloriously asserting her right to remain Christian, meaning of course Catholic, the nation of the Franks, one day to be known as the eldest daughter of the church, was entering the true fold. So known as the eldest daughter of the church, for one thing, countless saints have come from France. Look at the martyrologies. Many of them are from France. And the eldest daughter of the church, not in the sense of the first, well, probably not the first state that could be characterized as a Catholic nation, but certainly the first of the nations of Western Europe that we know to this day to be forged as a Catholic nation. And in many ways, yes, but you could make might be up to some debate. The French would not admit it's up to debate, but perhaps making the greatest contributions of any nation ever to the service of the church. Potentially, you might be able to make a case for that. We're not entering into that now, and I would never seek to argue about that with the French. But potentially, the French would consider it outrageous even to say that that's not a certitude right away, probably. So, the nation of the Franks entering the true fold. So, a Germanic tribe, so it's not as though Germany conquered France and started ruling it, things were a little bit different at the time. A Germanic tribes moved around a lot. And interesting, it might be strange to consider now just how different France and England are, how they've been allies for a long time, since must be the 1850s, I think it was during the 1850s, yes, that the Crimean War was fought, and that was considered groundbreaking at the time, 1850s, that France and England joined forces to fight Russia. The fight was over the city of Sebastopol, in fact. The French and the British besieged Sebastopol together, giving rise to the famous Charge of the Light Brigade. A famous poem was written about that by Alfred Lord Tennyson, was his name. Man who wrote the poem. But that was considered groundbreaking because France and England were calling France and England old enemies doesn't cut it. The enemies for far too many centuries yet for anybody ever to forget the fact. I mean, to this day, they don't like each other. Technically, they're not when England going to war against France is nearly inconceivable nowadays, but definitely they don't like each other. So, putting all that aside, it's interesting to consider that at the time, the tribes that existed that lived in Great Britain, with the province that the Romans called Britannia, and the tribes that lived in the area that they called Gaul, they were related. All those tribes were related. And we'll get to it later on, obviously, down the line. But it was really due to the Norman conquest of England that gave rise to all of the trouble that has existed for so many centuries between France and England. Because that gave rise, what happened was, obviously William the Conqueror was Duke of Normandy. Now, the Normans had been northern, hence the name suggests, Northmen, is what they were. They had come from the north. They had been Viking raiders, but they'd settled in France and become Frenchmen, in fact. So they were French, but the Normans were definitely French. But William the Conqueror was Duke of Normandy and decided to conquer England. The French kings were not powerful at that time. So William the Conqueror decided, I'm going to go and conquer a separate kingdom for myself, while remaining Duke of Normandy. So he was still Duke of Normandy, while then also being King of England. So you had this very awkward situation of a king of a nation being technically a duke of a duchy in another nation, owing allegiance to the monarch of that nation. And that gave rise to the fact that the English and French don't like each other to this day. All the troubles, the 100 Years' War, all the friction, the constant, the most steadfast enemy of Napoleon was Great Britain. Every other nation that fought him, nobody liked him, but every other nation in Europe was, at least on paper, allied with him at one time or another, because they would fight against him, he would blow them away, and then they would be forced to, as a condition of signing a peace treaty, of condition of having the war end so that he wouldn't completely conquer them and destroy everything. A necessary condition of that was that they become his allies and even give him troops. So some various nations that had fought against him, against Napoleon, made up significant portions of his 300,000-man Grande Armée that invaded Russia in 1812. So, but the point is, the British were never ever a part of that. Even when everybody else was either allied or had some arrangement with Napoleon, the British never made an agreement with him, ever. So they were in a better position to do that than anybody else. The English Channel has afforded the English countless advantages over time. Prevented Napoleon from invading them, prevented Hitler from invading them. It's It's better than any. It's the best natural defense there is, the English Channel, for them. Of course, they're the ones who call it the English Channel. But anyway. Okay. So France is coming into being. At this time, the nation is being forged. So we have Gregory of Tours, an early historian of this glorious race. No, Darius is French. Keep that in mind. So you do have to understand the characteristics of various nations. And various nations do have characteristics, just as families have characteristics. Nations are, or can be looked upon, certainly, as extended families. Every nation has its ways of doing things, its virtues, its vices, certainly. Its good characteristics, its bad ones. And one of the characteristics of the French, for better or worse, is that they are, all of them extremely, certainly those who are not communists, extremely devoted to France as a nation. I mean, to the point of almost worshiping it. I mean, that's scarcely an exaggeration. They almost to that point. I mean, certainly I'm not accusing them of the sin of idolatry, but the reverence is so high that when you see it manifested, you think this sounds an awful lot like worship. So have to keep that in mind, and that's actually one reason why we stopped using Darius at a certain point, because being French, he's actually enamored of Napoleon, who was just if there's one person in the history of the entire world you want to give the title of rat to, is Napoleon. He was just this disgusting, opportunistic rat. And that's it. I mean, low character, revolutionary, just everything was wrong with him. He was a military genius. That's about the one thing that was right with him. He put it to put to the use of just waging wars of conquest for 15 or so years. More than that, but approximately 15 years. He started even before 1800. He was fine. His last defeat was Waterloo, 1815. But that was about the one thing he had in his favor. He was really good at fighting. Everything else, he was a disaster. Maybe he did. Maybe there may have been some times in which he ruled France at least competently, but he certainly isn't famous for great wisdom in running a national government, because nobody ever talks. He didn't get famous for that, because he only got famous for waging wars constantly. So, almost constantly, there may have been some interruptions. Tension was there the whole time he was in power. Right, so Darius tries to make it seem a really great thing when Pius VII and Napoleon signed a Concordat, and he said, this is a really great thing. Tries to hold it up as being the great French monarch and the great Pope coming together, making an agreement. It was Napoleon was not nice to the church. You look at the facts of the matter, what he did, he was terrible. And that is far beyond what we're looking at right now, but you have to understand your author. So, talking about it as a glorious race, he's not an impartial observer in saying that. So we don't need to go through this whole quote here, but the point is, we can go on to the right-hand column on page 96. Clovis, the son of Childeric, was in command only of the small tribe of the Franks of Tournai when he defeated the Roman patrician Syagrius at Soissons. So he's emerging as the skillful politician, an intrepid warrior, though still a heathen, made every effort to win the favor of the Catholic clergy for his cause, as he held their holy mission and salutary influence in the highest veneration. So he's not yet converted. He will, very famously, he will. It's no surprise to anybody. It's very famous that he eventually converted and received baptism. But even before that, he was favorable to the church. So keep that in mind. Not everybody who is not a member of the church has it out for the church. Not everybody persecutes the church. Sometimes there are people who are not Catholics who you think that he should be. How is he not a Catholic? He seems to think very highly of Catholics and of the church, and lament the deeds of heretics and those who are not Catholics. For example, I forget the name of the author at the moment, but there's a book called the Protestant Reformation in England and Ireland. I cannot remember the name of the author at this moment, but he was a Protestant who wrote this book, and it is the most damning thing ever written about Protestantism in England and Ireland. I mean, you just read one horrifying instance after another of things done by Protestants in the name of the Reformation, and so on and so forth. And you think this is absolutely, I mean, a Catholic could not have done a better job of writing an attack on Protestants. But he's a Protestant who wrote it. But at the end, I remember at one point in the book, we had it read at table some years ago, I remember. And at one point, the author says that, well, so despite all of this, he says he'll still be a Protestant, and his parents were, and it was what he was born into, and he'll die that way. For things like that, purely human considerations like that, people refuse to embrace the faith. Also, there's the question of sometimes Anglicans specifically accept many of the truths of the faith. They might even acknowledge, say, transubstantiation. They might acknowledge Our Lady as being the Mother of God and worthy of veneration, maybe immaculately conceived. They might recognize all of those things. They might become what are so-called Anglo-Catholics, which they're not Catholics. They're still Anglicans, but they share so many things in common with Catholics. They profess so many of the truths of the faith, and their liturgy is so done up. In fact, that's a characteristic of certain false religions, not all of them certainly, but some of them, that they really, really do it up when it comes to whatever passes for liturgical services. And that's certainly true of the High Church Anglicans, specifically the Anglo-Catholics. They really do it up. It's really over the top. And you can see that actually in the Novus Ordo as well. As somebody mentioned, it's probably less than a week ago, that some FSSP place, they would do these Mozart masses, which are better suited, for the most part, better suited for the concert hall. I mean, there's magnificent music, no question. But so long. A mass would go on and on and on, so long. I mean, that's not a bad thing in itself. The mass cannot be too long. But by the laws of the church, the mass is not supposed to take so long that it'd be something wearisome to those who attend it. And that's something that the church takes into consideration. I remember that. Well, Zeke can ask his excellency about this at some point, but he said that Archbishop Lefebvre told him, or at least other priests or seminarians, many decades ago, that when Archbishop Lefebvre, was a seminarian, they were told that ideally Mass takes 25 minutes. Now, I don't know how that's physically possible to say even a low Mass, even without distribution of Holy Communion, without a sermon, in less than 25 minutes. That is fast. Ever seen a priest who says Mass quickly? Probably. I mean, I suppose you could see somebody who says Mass that fast, but most priests are probably, if not physically incapable, almost physically incapable of saying Mass that fast. I mean, if you were to try, you'd make so many mistakes. There are so many things to get exactly right, and you could count how many Latin words you have to pronounce in the course of the Mass, not the words of consecration themselves, but all the propers and the common prayers of the Mass. I have to do all of that, and many motions that go along with that all are in themselves nailed down with pinpoint precision what is supposed to be done in every given moment. It's a very intense thing to say Mass, and to rush to go through that quickly would take, maybe that, whether it's describing the absolute ideal of saying Mass, is to do it in a low Mass, that is, in 25 minutes. And that may also be excluding the Leonine prayers, which don't add much, but that's a minute or two. And you add a minute or two to 25, you're getting closer to 30 already, and 25. So anyway, the point is, the Mass is not meant to become a wearisome thing to those something. It's not supposed to become hateful, in other words, in any sense. That's something that's constantly throughout the works of moral theologians, especially with regard to the sacrament of penance. The sacrament is not to be made hateful to anybody, meaning that it's not to be made unpleasant to someone who might have some, according to some aspect, a legitimate grievance with, or legitimate complaint about the sacrament. So receiving strange penances or being yelled at in the confessional, things like that. Those are all things. It's just common sense that you not do those things. Moral theologians spell it all out anyway. But those are all things those are examples of things that could make the sacrament hateful to somebody. A reasonable person would find that unpleasant. Might be turned away from the sacrament. It could potentially. So, so reasonable, someone who's actually devoted to the sacraments would still approach, even if there's something unpleasant about it. But it's actually a grave obligation. The confessor is under grave obligation not to make the sacraments hateful to anybody. And so it's just really the same principle. The Mass is not meant to be wearisome to anybody. But sometimes you might get that. Yes, Mozart Masses. The specific example I was given was that the Agnus Dei would take 10 minutes. Imagine that. The Gregorian settings of the Agnus Dei, some of them are longer than others, some of them are very short, but never would it take 10 minutes to get to the Agnus Dei. 2 or 3 probably on average, but 5 at the most to get to the Agnus Dei, if it's a longer setting. Gregorian anyway. Even a polyphonic, a nice polyphonic might take a few minutes, but 10 minutes. That's, again, not too long in itself, but that's longer than anybody would expect the Agnus Dei to take. And you'd sit there thinking, okay, not to rush the Mass, but when is this going to be finished? And that's the kind of thing you want to avoid, as far as possible. Some people might think that anyway, but the point is, somebody who's following along diligently and with fervor would not think, okay, this is taking a while now. So, okay, so he avoided in his march to the great cities which had already submitted to him. So Clovis, he's already fairly decent. Even for a heathen tribal leader, he's fairly decent. This was the only means of saving from plunder the convents and basilicas which the piety of the faithful had immensely enriched. So you see at this point, yes, well, actually when Clovis converted, as I recall, the entire Frankish tribe converted, but they're not yet converted. In any case, as we've seen, there's still a strong pagan holdover even in Rome itself. There's a strong pagan holdover, that Lupercalia thing, disgusting Lupercalia thing. That's still ongoing even in the late 5th century. Some old habits do die very hard indeed. So there's still, we'll see that here, there's still a pagan hangover, so to speak. But he's still being decent as possible. They say his men, clearly would not hesitate to plunder churches and convents were they to be let loose on cities containing them. In one of the churches of Rheims, of which city St. Remigius, the most illustrious of the Gallic prelates, was then bishop, could not escape the rapacity of a band of marauding Franks. So it's Rheims in English, as in Douai Rheims. And yes, that is in fact a city in France, because the English, that approved English translation, which is by far the best, of sacred scripture, was done partly in Douai, the city of Douai, partly at Rheims, because the English college was located there at the time. It was during the time of Elizabethan persecution in England, when there was no possibility of training priests in England. Candidates for the priesthood had to go to France. So that's what happens typically. When things get troublesome in France, the French flee to England. When things are troublesome in England, the English go to France. That's where, for example, Louis XVI tried to get away from, when he had been overthrown and the revolutionaries were seeking to kill him. The idea was he tried to escape the country and was going to go to England. I think also Napoleon, the Prussians captured Emperor Napoleon III during the Franco-Prussian War, but I think his former empress after that went to England, if I'm not mistaken. And so the English, certainly, yes, many English priests were trained in France. So they don't like each other, but they like going to each other's countries at least sometimes. The English love visiting France, that's for sure. The French probably visit. French don't like to travel outside of their own country so much, but the English certainly like to visit France, and the French will go to England when things get too difficult for them in their own country. So this is Rheims. The French pronounce it Reims. Don't ask how that came to be. Or something like that. No doubt the French would still correct me on that, but it's close to it. But I mean, in English, Rheims, which is more, the French would not agree with this either, but a more reasonable pronunciation of that name, just based on how it's spelled, which that's an odd thing because French pronunciation is difficult for sure, but it is consistent largely. It's there are some exceptions to things, but there are not many, and it is phonetic. Now, how they started pronouncing that, I have no idea. Okay, probably a very long story to that one, which doesn't really concern us. So amongst the articles which formed their booty, that's an older word for loot, was a sacred vessel of unusual size and beauty. St. Remigius was informed of the act and sent to Clovis to claim the prize. So this St. Remigius is Saint-Remy, as the French like to abbreviate things. They like to. Most of the word would say butchered words. They would say improve upon the language from which they took it. So Saint Remigius. So also Ludovicus, that's Louis. They shortened that to Louis. So there's Ludovicus. And we don't even get started on the cities of France, which probably already heard some of those anyway. But, okay, we'll tell that story next time. Patrus et Filii et Spiritus Sanctum et subituum presidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostras epicationes et specias in necessitatibus sed periculis cunctis libera nos semper virgo gloriosa benedicta. Amen. Patrus et Filii et Spiritus Sanctum.